it's important for us to, it's kind of difficult to know how you follow that.
Absolutely.
I feel like we ought to be getting up and marching at this moment. But it is important for us to continue our conversation and to think then around what are the elements that we should be thinking about as we address this particular concern. So we have a panel of experts. I read from one of our experts who said that it's important for those who are near the problem to also, people who are near the problem are also near the solution. So we have individuals who are near the problem, who have experienced the issues of being involved in the criminal justice system. And I'm very honored to introduce to you three individuals who have various components of very involvement with the system. And our panel now is going to have an opportunity to talk about both the experiences of being involved in the incarceration system, as well as beginning to identify what are some of the issues that we should think about as a group of concerned citizens and students and others. I want to introduce our panelists. To my far left is Glenn Martin. Glenn is a criminal justice, and I should mention to all of you, there are bios of each of our presenters. So I'm not going to give you all of the information that you will find there, because you will find lots more information about each of our presenters. Glenn Martin is a criminal justice reform advocate who has spent 6 years in the New York State Prison. He's also the founder and president of JustLeadershipUSA, which advocates for mass incarceration issues. Next to Glenn is Ronald Simpson-Bey. Ronald describes himself as a jailhouse lawyer who got his conviction reversed by the courts and got himself out of prison. He also advocates for reducing the prison population and is an alumnus of Just Leadership USA. Steve Hoffman is currently an assistant attorney general and has been in this position since 2005. Prior to this position, he served as an assistant DA, assistant district attorney with the Middlesex District Attorney's Office. And prior to that, he served in the firm as a partner of Sugarman and Sugarman. I'm very grateful to have the three of them with me today as we try to unpack this issue around criminal justice and the system. And I just have and the conversation that we're going to have today is really a conversation. So we're actually going to pretend like y'all are not here. And we're actually just going to talk to ourselves for a while. And then we'll invite you to be part of our conversation as well. I guess the place to start the conversation is to reflect on how your experiences have shaped your understanding of the problems that we are talking about. And Glenn, I'm going to point to you first, and then we'll just kind of talk among ourselves for a bit. Is that good?
Thank you. So I really do get to follow Cornell.
Yeah.
So first of all, thank you, Harold, and thank you to the organizers of this conference. I'm really glad to be here. I'm glad to have Just Leadership USA represented in this space. I think Cornell did an amazing job of talking about the value of having people closest to the problem be closest to the solution and have their voices and leadership be a part of this discussion. Equally honored to be here with my colleagues on this panel. So I'm glad you started with journey and experiences, because Just Leadership USA really is the culmination of my experience growing up in a very poor community in Brooklyn, New York, high crime, right through the crack epidemic, HIV/AIDS, and all the other things that people of color were dealing with throughout those years. And having an older brother who went off into a different direction as he went into the military at the age of 17, ultimately becoming a federal correction officer and now a U.S. Marshal, and then having myself and my younger brother both end up doing time in prison. I served 6 years. And the first year was on Rikers Island in New York City. And if you've been following the news about Rikers Island, whether it's the Department of Justice report or Khalif Browder's case, his death, then you have a sense of what it's about. I mean, they call the place Gladiator School, and that is probably not even doing justice to the kind of hypocrisy that exists in that place. When you get to Rikers Island, you have to make a choice quickly. Either you're a predator or you're prey, and there's nothing in between. I was stabbed 4 times within the first 24 hours of being on Rikers Island in the cell, where correction officers looked on, laughed, and discouraged me filing any sort of complaint. And so that was my introduction to the criminal justice system. Believe it or not, people who end up serving time are keenly aware of what's going on around them and what sort of environment they're in. And the message to me was that the crimes that were being committed on Rikers by people in positions of authority were equally as bad, if not more so, than any crime I had experienced growing up in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. And then I got to state prison, and what I was blown away by is the fact that we lock up some of America's best and brightest. And we don't say that. That's not how we talk about mass incarceration. That's not even how we talk about criminal justice reform. But I'll tell you a story to make a point, and then I'll pass it over to my colleagues and hopefully get a chance to talk more about just leadership later on. In New York State, on any given day, there's a prison worth of prison guards on the road, traveling, moving inmates from one prison to the next. It's part of, arguably, the way that machine works to keep people employed. Unfortunately, upstate New York, there are many communities that wouldn't exist were it not for the prison that existed in their community. And I'm put into a prison, which is, picture, when you think of your quintessential sort of scary prison, big high walls, guard towers, dark cloud, lightning bolt. And they stopped at this prison on our way to the prison we were going to end up at. And they put us in this long tier of cells, really dark, rusty, and a set of windows along the tier. And you're put in there with another person who's serving time, because New York was double bunked at the time because it was so overcrowded. And I get in the cell, and this gentleman that was there, we got to know each other. We were going to be there together for 3 days. I got there on a Friday. We knew we weren't going to move again until Monday. And his name was Arthur. And Arthur had come into prison when he was 17. In New York State, at the age of 16, you're charged as an adult automatically. There's no discretion. So at the age of 16, you're an adult. And he came in at the age of 17, being charged with one of our mandatory minimums under our Rockefeller drug laws. And at the age of 17, he needed to make a decision about what he was going to do. And most people plea out, but he decided to go to trial. And so he ended up with 25 years to life. And when I met him, he had 17 years in. So he was still 34, relatively young, got addicted to drugs when he was in prison. In fact, he was also receiving medication through the prison cells while we were there together. So after a day or so, the cells got really cold, very deliberately, because the correction officers would open the windows to freeze out the people who were in the cells. And I started to catch a cold, and Arthur turns to me and he says, "Do you want me to make you a cup of tea?" And I was ready to yell for the CO to get me the hell out of that cell. But I said, "Sure, Arthur, make me a cup of tea." And he takes a plastic bottle that was in the cell with us, and he fills it with water. And he ties a string to it and ties it to the light fixture, and takes the toilet tissue and rolls it really tightly, and uses the lead from a pencil and the outlet in the cell to light the toilet tissue on fire, and have the bottle hover just over the fire so that the bottle melted and the water boiled. And he ripped open the collar to his prison outfit and took out 2 tea bags and put it into the bottle and handed me a cup of tea. And the reason I tell that story is because here's an individual whose hope, whose opportunity, whose future, arguably, was being extinguished by this system. And yet in that moment, he could still find the humanity to think about helping someone else who he had just met 24 hours earlier. And I think we need to allow the voices of people most impacted to be projected, because if we don't hear those sort of stories, then all we think about are inmates, convicts, ex-offenders, prisoners, and it is so easy to put those things into a cell for 23 hours a day and not think about it as your neighbor, your brother, your sister, your uncle, your aunt. I'll stop there.
I'd like to first say that I'm truly honored and privileged to be here among you today. And before I get into my story, Dean Cox handed everybody these cards to gauge a question. I just want to ask, before he told you that I was formerly incarcerated, how many of them could guess I was formerly incarcerated? That was just a joke. Okay. I was listening to the president of NAACP speak a minute ago. He talked about Dr. Martin Luther King's ties to this school. And it reminded me of one of my favorite quotes by Dr. King, where he says, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." And in this room, is obviously we are bending it towards justice. We talk about social justice, criminal justice reform, and the things that we are involved in this advocacy work. In 1985, I found myself in Flint, Michigan, standing at this intersection of race and prosecution in America. I found myself being run over by the truck called prosecution, and I suffered, as a result, 27 years of social injustice while I was sentenced to Michigan Department of Corrections for the crime of assault with intent to commit murder. During those 27 years, I fought every day, every week, every month for my freedom. I never gave up. I fought insurmountable odds, and in 2012, the courts finally agreed with me and reversed my conviction and set me free. So I stand here before you, a truly grateful person, as someone who has experienced these intersections that most people look from in a detached manner. I experienced them firsthand. While I was incarcerated, the first 5 years you go through phases when you're incarcerated. Knowing I was wrongfully convicted, I felt I was innocent, I went in very angry. I was 27 years old. I was an angry young man. I was already angry and aggressive from the streets. Being a black man on the streets of Flint, Michigan, unless you're into something positive, you're into something negative, and I was into both. So I went through 5 years of hardship, of anger, of fights like Dan talked about, fights, stabbing, you name it, we did it. But I had a transformational moment around 1990, 1991. I read a book called Visions for Black Men by Dr. Naeem Akbar. And in that book, it talked about the transformation of male to boy to man. And that book lit a fire in me. It made me change my focus. It made me change my direction and my lens through which I looked at criminal justice, and myself for that matter. So I went on and became an advocate in prison. I became a leader of all the organizations. I fought for everybody else's rights if I could. And during this time, in 2001, I was sitting on my bunk at a prison in Michigan. I had been in prison about 15 years at the time, maybe 16. Father's Day, I have 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. And every father, every parent wants to see their children, especially when you're in prison, because it's one of the dearest things to you. So my son, I talked to him that morning, "Dad, we're coming to visit you this afternoon." I said, "Great, I'd love to see all you guys. I'm going to pick the girls up, we'll be there." So 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock came. You're already anxious, but then when they're not showing up, I'm even more anxious. What's going on? Where's my family? 5 o'clock come, nobody. So I get on the phone, now I'm calling, can't catch anyone. What's going on? My mom, my children. So I just happened to call my ex-mother-in-law, because I've been divorced at this time. And she said, "You haven't heard, Ronnie?" I said, "No, what's going on, Mama?" She said, "Your son, Ronnie, has been shot and killed by a 14-year-old juvenile." My son was 21 at the time. In the streets of Flint, he was gunned down by a 14-year-old juvenile. I cannot begin to tell you the hardship that I felt behind it, the anger, the resentment. Everything boiled to the surface. But my spiritual foundation, my spiritual underpinnings allowed me to swallow and take a deep reflective moment. And it made me to ask myself the question, am I going to be true to what I practice and preach to other people? Am I going to be a hypocrite? I don't like being a convenient anything, so I like to be committed. So I forgave the child. I advocated for him to be treated as a juvenile, to be adjudicated through the court system as a juvenile, because I didn't wish prison on my worst enemy. And I surely saw no use in sentencing this child to life in prison as an adult. So this is what informs my work today as an advocate for social justice, for criminal justice reform, because our system is so I mean, I can't even give the word for it. But we have taken the humanity out of being human, and we need to put it back. So that's what brings me to this forefront today, and I'm honored to be here.
Mr. Hoffman.
Yeah, so I'm a late addition to the program. I'm not sure exactly how it went down, but
So, you know, we're grateful for you to be here.
Yeah, no, here's my, here's my deal. So we have a community outreach section of the Attorney General's office where I work. And by the way, before I say anything else, I think I'm required to give this a legal disclaimer that anything I express today is my personal view and not necessarily the views of Attorney General Maura Healey. But Attorney General Maura Healey, I'm proud to say, is extremely enlightened and is really a leader in this whole movement. She has, I'm going to tell you that it's a tough thing for anyone who's in a law enforcement or prosecutorial position to do because you're an elected official, and I think that's where a large part of the problem stems from. You can't be perceived as being soft on crime. You know, you're an elected official. How do you get elected? By pandering, you know, to being tough on crime, tough on crime. Well, my boss, Maura Healey, knows that you have to be smart on crime. You have to do the right thing. You have to do the right thing, you know, for the individuals who are involved in the system, and you have to do the right thing for the safety of the community. So I'm proud, very proud to work for Maura Healey. But, you know, again, Dean Cox didn't tell me this, but, you know, looking for a prosecutor. Yes, I'm a prosecutor, but, you know, there's sort of an asterisk next to it. For 23 years, the first part of my career, most of my career, I did private civil litigation. Around the age of 47, I sort of had the bug that I wanted to give back and do some public service. And I thought with the skill set I had, which was sort of technical and expert, that, you know, being a white-collar prosecutor would be the best skill set. I talked to some people who had, one judge who had been a former prosecutor and two people in private practice, defense practice, who had been former prosecutors, and they all said, well, if you want to do white-collar, that's okay, but don't go there right away. Go to a county district attorney's office. You've never been a prosecutor. Get down in the weeds, learn a prosecutor's ethics, and then if you want to move on, move on. So I went to the Middlesex district attorney's office, the county that goes just across the river from Cambridge up to Lowell and west out to Framingham region, and I did that for about 5.5 years. But it's sort of telling to me that when, again, I'm making an inference which may be unwarranted, that Dean Cox probably reached out to the district attorney's offices who are on the front lines. As an attorney general, we do white-collar cases, and it's really not the issue, you know, largely that brings us here today. I imagine there was an outreach, perhaps to Suffolk, perhaps to Middlesex and the other counties, with not much of a response. Now, to tell you how divorced I am from the mainstream, even in my office, I'm in a division called the Medicaid Fraud Division. The Medicaid Fraud Division, and we do both civil and criminal work. You know, it's unusual. We go after, we investigate and prosecute only providers, crooked providers in the Medicaid program. And so we're not even in the criminal bureau, okay? This is how out of it I am. But I'm the deputy chief, so.
You know, we really are glad you're here.
Yeah. So just to tell you, but we have a criminal bureau, and no one in the criminal bureau apparently would volunteer to come here and, you know, be on the firing line, so to speak. So then the chief of our criminal bureau reaches out to us and says, "Is there someone there who'll do it?" And, you know, like a damn fool, here I am. But no. But seriously, I'm delighted to be here, and this is a hugely important problem, and like I said, we've got to be smart. We've got to make it right.
So, Mr. Hoffman, I'm really glad that you're here. I think that's maybe the third time I've said that. And I think the thing that's valuable about each of you being here is that each of you has been and is involved in the system in any number of ways. Certainly your experiences in being in private practice, or your experience in the DA's office, and now your experience in the AG's office gives you an understanding of the system writ large. So it's important for us, as we think then around your involvement or the involvement of any number of people, that each of us is involved in the system in some way. So we're going to kind of think then of So in what way? And Glenn, I want to come back to you, and I see that there's something you want to raise about that in particular, but I want if you would talk a little bit more about how your experience, you gave us a sense of what it was like when you were in prison, but I'm wondering then what happened? And how did that actually help to shape the person that you are right now?
Thanks for that question. So let me first follow up with what I wanted to interject into the conversation you were just having. A few times you've said each of you have been involved in the system. Two things I want to bring up. One, there's no women on this stage, and I want to apologize for that. And I want to say that out loud. And it's something I continue to learn.
I did try.
Harold, I really am happy you're on this stage.
Okay, thank you ever so much. I'm so very grateful. So, okay, no women, we got the wrongs.
You gotta say,
I'm glad that all of you are here, and let's hear.
It wasn't an indictment. So the thing I wanted to bring up is you talk about how each of us have been involved in the system. The thing about the criminal justice system is that there's almost no past tense. There is almost no you were involved in the system. Once you've been involved in the system, you continue to be involved in the system. There are police officers that pull over, particularly young men of color, and the first question they ask them is, are you on probation and parole? Before they even ask for a driver's license. And I want to tell my story, which is a little bit atypical because it's 15 years out, but I think it helps to crystallize what I'm trying to share with this audience. About almost a year ago, I was in a meeting in D.C. I spend half my life in D.C. these days, particularly because President Obama has actually been so vociferous and action, and there's been so much action coming from the Department of Justice on this issue, and I've been invited into those spaces to be part of those discussions, which is great that this administration is open to leadership from people directly impacted. But here's how my engagement began. I was at a meeting that lasted about 7 hours with about 50 of my colleagues just down the block from the White House, knowing that that meeting would culminate in a visit with senior policy advisors at the White House. And once we were walking to the White House, I was actually walking with the prosecutor from Atlanta, Georgia, and we were having a discussion about some of the progressive things he was doing as a prosecutor, because there are some prosecutors who are enlightened and who get it. And then we get to the White House, and there's 50 of us, and everyone gets this green pass. And I get a red pass that said, needs escort. And so I was invited to the White House to have a discussion about mass incarceration and all of the collateral consequences that stems from it. And then I get to the White House, and I get stopped and they said to me, you can't go in until someone escorts you because people with criminal records can't be in the White House, even though my conviction is 21 years ago. And as an advocate, I decided that the Wall Street Journal might want to know about this. And they ended up printing an amazing piece, and the Washington Post printed an amazing piece. But when I got into the meeting, I used it as a moment. It was an hour-long meeting. I had missed 20 minutes of it as a result of this experience. And they were sort of going around the room and asking people, what was the most important thing from today that you want to share with the policy advisors? I said I had a laundry list till I got downstairs. And what I really want to share is that if the highest office in this land creates a scenario where 65 million Americans would be barred from walking past the threshold of the very office that we would entrust to respond to the sort of class that we've been relegated to. I mean, because in our criminal justice system at sentencing, we knock people down. We make it clear you're less than us. We're taking away these rights, these rights, these rights. We're sending you away, and this is who you are now. And then we have no equal ceremony to bring people back. And that moment in the White House reminded me of that. It reminded me of every moment I had spent in the criminal justice system. It reminded me of the label that this country has put on people who've been involved in the system, and the fact that you have to live with that for the rest of your life. So punishment rarely begins for people from the communities I come from when they go to prison, and it certainly doesn't abate when they leave prison. So I wanted to share that.
Thank you. So it's interesting as we begin to kind of think around there are many people who are involved in the system. The system has a negative impact on many individuals. And beginning to understand what are the problems then that we have in the system, I'm wondering if we can begin to kind of reflect then on that. And maybe, Mr. Hoffman, I would start with you, Steve, and kind of thinking through, so given the experiences that you've heard from both Glenn and from Ronald, what would you want to have had in your training as a prosecutor when you served in that role? Or what kind of training would you hope that other prosecutors would have so that they can ensure that the system is going to ultimately get to treating someone fairly and equitably?
Okay, it's a good question. It's there's a couple of aspects to it. First of all, I did, I think, what lawyers do when I was late add to the program, and I learned about Mr. Simpson-Bey's case, and so I went to Lexis and I researched the case, the Sixth Circuit case, and I read it. To use the vernacular, as I told Mr. Simpson-Bey, you got screwed, and badly, and it's something that I'm confident in saying. Would not have happened in the offices where I worked, either in Middlesex or certainly in the Attorney General's office where I work now. It has to start at the top. There has to be a culture. There has to be a culture of prosecutorial ethics. And if it's not, and it can only come from the top with leadership. Otherwise, the system can devolve into chaos. One of the trainings that I had when I started as a Middlesex district attorney assistant district attorney back in 1999, we had our first week. You go to the training, and you had the ethics training, and we were handed a copy of our prosecutors' rules of conduct, rules of professional responsibility, Rule 3.8, and comment 1 to Rule 3.8, which I photocopied and I've kept a copy of it, in my top desk drawer everywhere I've worked, says that the role of the prosecutor is not merely that of an advocate, but you are a minister of justice. Okay, and it's powerful words, and I try to live by it and never forget it. So our responsibility is not to get convictions and not just to engage in this advocacy system. Our first responsibility is to see that justice is done. But it doesn't work unless you have a person, people at the top who create this culture, and your organization, your office is inculcated with that culture. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is the laws. And the laws really, it's not a question of who the district attorneys are, it's your legislature and ultimately, your governor. We have these mandatory minimum laws, for drugs, which Glenn has certainly talked about, and I think they're probably even more draconian from the sounds of it in New York than they were here in Massachusetts, but they're bad. I'm proud to say that, that my boss, Attorney General Maura Healey, has come out publicly against most of these mandatory minimum, sentencing laws. But just to give a small example that I was involved with when I was doing so-called street crime as as an old but rookie, assistant district attorney in the district courts of Massachusetts. One of the courts I was assigned to was Lowell, which is an urban court, city north of Boston. And the law is called, for drug cases, a school zone law. So for a distribution, I'm talking about, it could be passing, a joint to someone, that constitutes distribution, or the lowest level sort of, street deal. Well, there's, for a first offense, there's no mandatory minimum. But the law, in its infinite wisdom, said that if the crime occurs within 1,000 feet of a school or a park, there is an additional charge which has to be served from and after the original sentence, which could be probation. So it's basically a mandatory minimum 2 years. For a first offender, for a kid doing something who just had the happenstance to live in an urban area. Now, again, I was a rookie prosecutor, but, I was, 47 at the time. I try to be an informed citizen, and I say to myself, and I say maybe a little bit too loudly to my colleagues, this is nuts, this is crazy. This is penalizing people of color. This is creating, a racially, disparate system. A little anecdote. I tend to go on. That's what lawyers do, and I think it's much more important to hear, what Glenn and Ron have to say. But I want to share this with you. So I'm in Lowell District Court, and you pick up your cases, and you look at the district court complaint and what the charges are, and I get a case. And every case I have, it's possession with intent to distribute is count 1, and count 2 is the school zone. And I get one, and it's in the city of Lowell, and there's no school zone. And, not that I'm disappointed, believe me, but because, we don't, the police take out the charges, and we prosecute the case we're given. So the case comes on for trial, and the officer shows up, and, we're getting ready to see where the case is going to send out to. And I say to the officer, I said, not a complaint, but just curiosity, why didn't you charge school zone? And I thought I was going to get an answer that this was an enlightened officer who felt the same way that I did about, the mandatory minimum. That wasn't the answer. He said, well, it's funny you should ask that. He said, this hand-to-hand took place in a shopping center, a strip mall, way on the west side of Lowell, on the border of the town of Chelmsford. He says, this is the only place, I believe, in the city of Lowell where you can distribute drugs and not be in a school zone. He said, this defendant, I have to say one thing about him, is probably the smartest drug dealer I've ever dealt with. Again, but so again, recently, I think it was about 2010, 2012, I'm away from those crimes, but fortunately, our school zone statute, it's still on the books, but I mean, it's been reined in so that, the area around the school is reduced from 1,000 feet, I think, to 300 feet. There are certain hours where, it's not in effect. And again, understand that, I was given these cases, and it's not a question of ethics, by the way, so if you look at me and say, if you felt that way, why did you participate in the system? Number one, I didn't write the law. Number two, I didn't take out the charge. And basically, it's not a question of prosecutorial ethics. If there's a law in the books which is found to be valid and it's charged, my obligation, is to speak out to the extent that I can. But if I said I'm not, I refuse to do this, well, I'm going to be fired, and someone else is going to, take my place who's going to do it, and perhaps not have the same enlightened view, about the criminal justice system that I did. So. Those are my comments.
Mr. Hoffman, let me just say I'm glad you're here. Okay, that's the fourth time I think I've said that now. So I'm going to invite all of you to participate in a conversation in a moment. So please think about the kinds of questions that you would like to talk with our panelists about. But I want to stay on this issue around what's going wrong with our system, what's not working so well, and perhaps. Glenn, this is a good place to begin to talk about Just Leadership USA and the kind of challenge that organization is now putting forth. Because I want to see how that then blends with what Steve is talking about of the culture that is important.
Thanks. I'll be brief because I want Ronald to have a chance to chime in also. So at Just Leadership USA, when we launched less than 2 years ago, we sent out an email to the field to about 15,000 relationships that I had built over the last 13 years. And we didn't have any resources or anything. We had a concept paper, but we began with a mission, and the mission was to cut the number of people under correctional supervision in this country in half by 2030. And as you can imagine, a few of my colleagues picked up the phone and called me and asked me had I lost my mind. But what I know as someone directly impacted is, first of all, that reflects this sort of vision that people closest to this problem have for reform. And it was the antithesis of what I experienced in the field, which is a field that was really mired in incrementalism. And when I left, when I took a week off from my previous job as the senior vice president at a pretty prestigious nonprofit in New York City, it was the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which seems to be a theme today, Dr. King. But I was at home with my 3-year-old, Joshua, and I was listening to Dr. King's speech over and over on the television. And I was writing this concept paper for Just Leadership USA, and I just kept asking myself, if going forward seems daunting to solve this issue of mass incarceration, if you look historically, you actually feel much less daunted. You actually recognize that in this country, there's a bit of a roadmap for how we address systems of oppression. And one ingredient that is in every other movement is that the people who have been most oppressed by the system need to be positioned to rise up and be able to define the system of oppression themselves, and help define the solution to the problem. Otherwise, we try to build a movement with no face and no leadership of the people most impacted. And I can't think of any other movement that works that way. And what I've seen from the field in criminal justice reform is an adoption of the stigma that this country has done such a good job of placing on people most impacted. So what do? We serve up the perfect prisoner to make the case. This first-time nonviolent drug offender who went to prison for 20 years for selling marijuana. I don't know who those two guys are. And even if you convince the American public that those guys didn't belong there, that's all you've convinced them. You haven't convinced them that there's an entire system that works for no one. At Just Leadership USA, we deliberately don't ask about the type of conviction when people apply for our year-long leadership training. So we end up, guess what, with people who have sex offenses. Why? Because they're not served well by the system either. And because they have a story to tell. And because the story is always more nuanced than what you get on the evening news. And the story has a lot to do with, guess what? Public health. And the fact that the public health arena has seemed to divorce itself from the people who have ended up now in the criminal justice system. And the fact that our criminal justice system now is a surrogate for all of the services that people used to receive in the public health space before our system of criminal justice became so brown and so black. And so the reason I'm so heartened to be in rooms like this is because I put a tremendous amount of hope in people who are in the public health space coming back to take a closer look at what happened over the last 45 years in this country, because it's been about 45 years that we've engaged in this failed experiment, but also to bring the values that are inherent in the public health space to our space. Why? Because you guys think about community. You think about how these issues impact entire communities, whereas in the criminal justice system, it's an adversarial system that ultimately puts the responsibility on the individual. I had a chance to talk to Sandra Day O'Connor at Harvard a few years ago, and I asked her a question about the consequences that stem from involvement in the criminal justice system. And Justice O'Connor, with all due respect, responded to me in front of an audience of 400 people, well, you know, when you commit a crime, all the punishment that stems from it comes with that initial decision to break the law. And I said to her, what about disproportionate impact of the criminal justice system on people of color? And she was just stuck. Embarrassingly stuck in front of this audience of 400. But what troubled me the most is, here's a person who was in a very high position of privilege and power and hadn't given enough thought to that. And then the next day we ended up having breakfast that day quite serendipitously. We just ended up there early together and had a discussion that I think helped her to much better understand what I was trying to convey to her in front of that audience. But it happened as a result of her talking to a human being who was experiencing those things, who could help her better understand, because people, what I know about people in positions of privilege is like, it is the equivalent of trying to convince a fish that he is wet. It is hard for people who are privileged to understand what that means to be privileged. To understand what, yesterday I got on the train in New York City in a suit, and I'm standing next to a woman, and I turned to let people on the train, and my leg must have hit her pocketbook, and she clutched that pocketbook so tightly. And that is the kind of stress and trauma that black people in this country live with every day. And people in positions of privilege who don't experience that have a hard time understanding that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Ronald, so you are an alumnus of Just Leadership USA.
Yes.
What has that meant for you?
Wow, that's a great question. It has meant the world to me. And I was going to say that I'm an alumni of Just Leadership. I went through Glenn's program last year, and it was truly a great experience, an eye-opening experience, and a life-altering experience. And as you know, as you heard him say, one of our models is those closest to the problem are closest to the solutions. And I always tease Glenn, if I get any closer to the problem, it's going to kill me. After 27 years, I don't need to be any closer to the problem. So I was glad to be part of the solution. And as a side, I would like to, I didn't share with everyone because I figured he would be a little uncomfortable. My conviction was overturned because of prosecutor misconduct. I didn't share that as part of my story because I didn't want him to think he was being targeted up here.
He already thinks he's,
I know, exactly. But one of the overarching things I want everyone to take away from this whole struggle in which we're in is that we've gotten so bogged down as being tough on crime. And I'm not knocking that, but let's be tough on results. People spend all this time in prison and no one takes any thought as to what type of person is returning to our communities. We just warehouse them, don't care anything about it. We mistreat them. It's like having a dog in a kennel, not feeding him and poking him with a stick. When you let him out, what do you think he's going to do? He's going to bite you. But if you take some time to show this human interaction one-on-one between the person that's incarcerated and the community, takes an interest. It doesn't have to be anything elaborate. You just writing a letter, showing interest. It'll make such a big difference on the psychological and the characteristic of the person that will return to your community. It may make the difference of when you walk to the store, the gas station, of a young man opening the door for you or pulling a gun on you. It'll make a big difference that we should be more concerned about being tough on results as we are being tough on crime.
So I have two questions for you, for your cards. And then I'd like for you to also queue up for questions. And there are microphones that are that will be as you raise your hands. The first question that I have for you is, speaking about yourself, people currently in prison deserve to have a second chance. Second question. I want you to think about your neighbor. Pick a neighbor, it doesn't matter who. And I want to ask the same question. People currently in prison, and this is what your neighbor would think, what you think your neighbor would think. People currently in prison deserve to have a second chance. Interesting. Let's hear what you're thinking. What's on your mind? Yes.
Hi, I work for a small municipal public health in social justice. I do the human rights, anti-violence, LGBTQ, marginalized populations. Thanks to a very beloved mentor of mine who's about my age but has had a lot more experience to teach me about restorative justice. And I know Maura Healy's office is a fan of restorative justice. I'm a Quaker. I know of a lot of interactions between accountability, forgiveness, taking responsibility, and rebuilding and doing the welcoming. I was wondering if each of you might be able to speak about restorative justice and public health and the criminal justice system.
I'd like to respond to that. It's funny you say you're a Quaker. My job I just left was with the American Friends Service Committee, the Quaker organization. And they're committed to peace initiative and social justice work internationally. And my job as a Quaker at the American Friends Service Committee required me to develop a program on which I built on restorative justice principles of a one-on-one interaction between those serving life and long sentences in Michigan with the one-on-one people in the community for a long-term co-mentorship relationship based on restorative justice principles. Because what we want to do, we want to heal the harms in both the community and in the perpetrators of the crime. And what we did, traditional restorative justice, there is the element of, there's usually a dialogue between the offender and the perpetrator and the victim. We expanded the definition to include the community as secondary victims because the community suffers from crimes as much as the actual victim. So we tried to give the community the tools to empower themselves to impact who's going to return to the community through this one-on-one relationship built on restorative justice principles.
Can I jump in on that? First of all, when you said I'm a Quaker, I got a little nervous because I stole him from the Quaker. So thought you were here to get him back. So as someone running an organization with such a bold and ambitious goal, people often say to me, well, if not this current adversarial system, then what? And I put a lot of stock in restorative justice as an answer to that question. And I just want to point out two examples that I think about quite often. If you Google New York Times and can forgiveness play a role in criminal justice, I think is the title. There's a case in Florida where a young man and a young woman who were childhood sweethearts, and they were young and they'd been together for many years, and there's no evidence of violence in the relationship. And one day, in a rage, he killed his girlfriend. And her parents, through their faith, decided immediately to contact the prosecutor's office and say, we do not want harsh punishment here. we want some version of restorative justice. And it's probably the only case in the country where there was such a serious crime with a victim, and where the judge and the prosecutor allowed for this discussion about restorative justice, which ended up being that although he was sentenced to prison, that he comes out of the prison and joins the family and goes around the state talking about violence in the home and what led to him committing the crime and so on. And so I urge folks to read that story in the New York Times, because I think it's a good example of restorative justice. The other example is on MSNBC. I think people know you can sort of binge watch criminal justice shows all day long. And although I probably shouldn't admit in front of an audience, I tend to do that, like most other Americans, turn on the TV and just watch those over and over. And there was a story recently about Alaska where because there's these fishing towns that rely on the men in particular to be fishermen for the town to continue to operate, they pushed back really hard on traditional law enforcement in terms of the way they charged with crimes, and instead set up a restorative justice model where the community plays a role in justice, where all stakeholders are involved. And it's just, a model that you can't get Americans, unfortunately, to do anything that's not done here in this country. And at least there's an example in Alaska where this is happening and it's working. So I'd urge people to look towards Alaska as an example.
Other questions? Yes.
Gentlemen, first off, thank you so much for being here today. I am truly honored to hear your stories. One question that I had actually was related to the impact of mass incarceration on families. So I used to formerly work for a program that served Boston Public Schools. There was about a quarter of students with incarcerated parents, both mothers and fathers. And I was wondering if you can speak a bit more about the impact of mass incarceration on family, and also on the predatory practices that are often directed at families in regards to monetary sort of regulations in regards to providing services for those who are obtaining any sort of resources for their incarcerated family members, transportation services. So I was hoping you can speak a little more on that.
The impact of incarceration on families is so pernicious, it's so pervasive, and it's almost ubiquitous. The community doesn't really recognize it, but it creates a whole subculture of people in our community because of the economic and psychological impact that it has on the families. The parents, if you got, I had, my mother was still alive, and she is now, but come after today is her birthday. Happy birthday, Mom. The impact that it had on my mother, because I was 27 years old when I went to prison, and about 10 years later, I had this epiphany, and I had to ask her, did she think it was her fault that I went to prison, even though I had been grown and married on my own, and she thought it was her fault that I had gone to prison. My children, even though I tried to keep a real close contact with them, it was tenuous at best, and even today, I'm still estranged from one of my daughters, even though I have close relationships with the other two. And you talked about the economic impact. The phone calls are astronomical. You get 15 minutes and you can talk. When I was in, 15 minutes cost you almost $20 for a phone call. You talk about transportation. A lot of people, the prisons are placed so far away from the inner city communities from which the prisoners come that they have to get bus or van services to take them, which is astronomical. Then they have to get overnight stay at hotels, which costs them again. And it's just on and on. And send them money for commissary, for clothes, because the clothing that they provide you is inadequate. I was a part of a lawsuit in Michigan, criminal justice thing, on justice of confinement, conditions of confinement, dealing with the clothing issue in Michigan. And the judge ruled that the coats were inadequate for Michigan winters because people were getting frostbitten from poor gloves. They were getting colds and pneumonia. So the impact on the community is... I can't even adequately provide it to you because it's so huge.
There is one time for one more question here.
Thank you. Hi, Sarah Cisco, public health professional, New York City. Thank you all so much for your insight today. And I know that New York City is involved in really trying to think holistically about how to address fairness in the criminal justice system by looking at a host of different time periods from the moment that somebody, for example, touches the system and then all the way through it upon release. Policymakers really need data, and they need to understand indicators, and I understand that we, as public health, are trying to think out of the box, much along the lines of NAACP in terms of providing medication and access to health care and those kinds of things that I think we traditionally would provide as public health. But what are we not measuring? What are we not looking at as an indicator? I think families and the impact there is one direction. But I would say, even though we are more likely to think of prevention and more likely to think about communities and what that impact is, can you name something that when you were released, and I'm directing it to both of you in particular, that you wish somebody was paying attention to beyond training, for example, beyond, you know, services?
Yeah, I'll jump in. That's a really good question. So I'm surprised. Well, I'm not surprised. Clearly, like, this is a room full of the choir, if I can say that. I mean, I can tell just by the cards that go up and the questions, because no one has asked the question, what about the victim? And that's a question you usually get as you're having this discussion about reentry and people involved in the criminal justice system. So the first response I'll say about what New York is doing, I think it's fascinating that there are many agencies in New York City that are finally stepping up and saying we need to do something different. Let's watch the data and let's try to move the needle on this. My concern about that, the double-edged sword of that, is that the criminal justice system continues to be the vehicle to those opportunities and services for one group of New Yorkers, while other New Yorkers get it through other vehicles, right? Healthcare, good jobs, and so on. And so I think we have to continue to think about that, right? How not to build a better criminal justice system, but instead how to reduce significantly the number of people that have any interaction with the system itself. The thing that stood out for me, and I go back to the conversation about victims versus offenders, because we have this adversarial system, and to undo it, we need to think about where the power in the system comes from. And a big part of it comes from prosecutors suggesting that they represent the victims of crime. And I was on a panel like this next to Cy Vance, who's the Manhattan District Attorney, about 2 years ago, and we were having a discussion just like this one. And an hour into it, he said, you know, folks, we've been here talking about people who commit crimes for the last hour, and we have said nothing about the victims of crime. And it was just like on cue. Like, you know, you expect any quintessential prosecutor to sort of jump in and play that card. And I looked at him and said, you know, Cy, with all due respect, I didn't learn how to pull a gun on someone until someone pulled a gun on me. And I think we often forget that crime is extremely local. People don't get on buses and planes to go commit crimes. They commit it in their neighborhood, on their block, in their building, in their apartment, against themselves. And the one thing I wish would have been a part of the discussion for me as I traveled through the criminal justice system and then out the other end is a conversation about what that sort of multi-generational trauma looks like. And how do we identify it much earlier on, much further upstream, before that behavior turns into offending behavior? And how does that become a part of the dialogue about how we address criminal justice going forward? And it didn't happen for me until a decade later, where a boss of mine said, you know, you seem to have a really high appetite for risk as a manager. You might want to talk to someone about that. And what I found out after talking to someone was that in some ways I was trying to replicate what I sought out in the street as a young person, except in the workplace. And then I had just a long conversation about that sort of trauma, the trauma of being a victim, the trauma of having a person put a gun to my stomach and take a ring off my finger and then never telling anyone about it, being such a man that there was no need to talk about it, no need to go to the police about it, like just deal with it. And then have that happen over and over, and not always by the hands of my neighbors, but sometimes by the hands of police officers. And that's just not a discussion in this space, unfortunately. And it continues to allow us to hold on to this adversarial system, which is you cannot build anything good on top of the current foundation that we have, unfortunately.
The conversation that we're having today is an important one. And the thing that I'd like for each of you, in just the few seconds that we have left, to, in our conversation, to think about is we have an audience of current public health professionals, some who are studying to become public health professionals, and others who are interested in this particular topic. But I want you to talk to our students for a moment. And I want you to say the thing that you would have us as a school, and particularly our students, to think about as they become more sensitized to this issue, as they consider this as an area for further study. What would you say to them?
From my perspective, I would say, you as the future, thought leaders need to give legislators, prosecutors, district attorneys, governors, the evidence base to make smart decisions about crime, okay? So that it's not just a question of, it's an election cycle and I'm tough on crime and I'm for mandatory minimum and my opponent is going to, turn people back to the streets. You need to give the evidence base, the research, so that confidently, people who are running for re-election can say, I'm not being soft on crime, I'm being smart on crime. This is not only the right thing to do for the affected communities and the affected individuals, this is the right thing to do for public safety. So that's my hope.
For me, my hope is that each of you, especially in the school, would work on heart and mind change. Because if we're going to have any chance at sustainable reform, it has to come at the heart and mind level. Because policy can be changed by the stroke of a pen, which we see all the time. Policy change is good. The data has always been there. They ignore the data when it's convenient for them to ignore the data. So I would say let's work on changing hearts and minds. And those who that's in social justice work and doing psychology and stuff, understand that people are humans. Understand that the people that commit these crimes, that hurt people. And most time by the time you see a person that's committed a crime, you only judge them from the point of the crime afterwards and not what happened to him in his life prior to that. So while we spend a lot of time, and rightfully so, addressing the victim's issues, we also have to address the issues of those who have committed these crimes, the trauma that they have suffered. So let's not be cynical. Let's work on heart and mind change in everything that you do. Keep it from a lens of how can I change heart and minds through what I'm doing.
I would say that in this country right now, we're having a series of moments around this issue of mass incarceration. And we need to go from moment to movement. And there's no such thing as a movement without students, period. Young people stand to inherit the criminal justice system that the rest of us have created. So therefore, you have the most stake in what you ultimately inherit. But you also have the power to change that system, and not later on in your career, right now. Whatever privilege you have, and every single person sitting in this room has some level of privilege. Think about how you not just identify that privilege and step away from it, but how you wield it. We talk about Dr. King. Dr. King stood alongside many people that did not look like him, many people that were much more privileged than him. And every movement in this country and elsewhere has been a marriage of people with less privilege and people with more privilege, but where the people with more privilege were willing to spend that privilege and make themselves vulnerable in some way or another. And in this issue, we do not move the needle unless people of privilege stand alongside people with less privilege and say that we need to do so. The last thing I'll leave you with is, unfortunately, systems change people long before people change systems. And so as you move into your career, think about how you shift systems by showing leadership and what a heavy lift that will be, and how do you position yourself to be able to do so. Because I have seen people who I grew up with, my older brother, end up in law enforcement and end up so much more conservative than folks like me who ended up on the other side of that equation. And so I would urge you to think about that public health has some of the same biases and inequities that we have in our criminal justice system. And you're stepping into a space where you're going to have to move the needle on that also. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Please thank our panelists.